July 6, 1995.
Everybody grab your mask. Everybody grab your mask.
It's been a mystery for over 2 years. But new tapes shed light on the biggest controversy of all. The Waco tapes, a Nightline exclusive. You'll hear the evidence tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Throughout the 51-day siege of the Branch Davidian compound outside Waco, Texas in the winter and spring of 1993, agents of the federal government taped their telephone conversations with David Koresh and several of his Branch Davidian followers. Working with the lawyer of one of the survivors, journalist Dick Revis gained access to those audio tapes and the 20,000 pages of conversation that were transcribed from them. Those of you who watched this program last night heard several of those tapes being broadcast for the first time. A subject that came up repeatedly during the siege was that of fire. One Branch Davidian even suggested to an FBI agent that the government might be planning to burn the compound down to eradicate evidence that might show how agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms shot into the compound before receiving any outgoing fire. But tapes that we'll play for you tonight provide some compelling evidence that the Davidians set fire to their own compound once the FBI assault began on April 19th. The events of that day began with an early morning wake-up call to Steve Schneider, a close friend and follower of Davidian leader David Koresh.
Steve, this is Byron Sage. Can you hear me now? Okay, this is Byron Sage. I need to advise you of something that's very important. Can you understand me? Okay. We're in the process of placing tear gas into the building. This is not an assault. We are not entering the building. Do you understand that? Do not fire your weapons. If you fire, fire will be returned.
The FBI calls shortly before this starts to tell Steve Schneider that it's fixing to tear gas the place and that everyone should leave. During this conversation, a tank accidentally runs over the telephone line.
Okay, they've hung up the phone.
They've hung up the phone.
When this happens, Steve Schneider throws the telephone outside because this is the only means he has of telling them that something's wrong with the phone.
There would be no further dialogue between FBI negotiators and the Branch Davidians. At this point, the FBI was reduced to communicating with the compound by loudspeaker. The dialogue that began on the day of the first raid, 50 days before, had been reduced to a monologue.
The gas you will be smelling is a non-lethal tear gas. This gas will temporarily render the building uninhabitable. You are under arrest. This standoff is over. It's now 6:10. We're getting initial information that shots have been fired.
Even though Koresh and the others didn't know it, their voices were still being monitored by the FBI. During an earlier point in the siege, FBI technicians had planted listening devices in one of the milk deliveries. Those bugs were still operating.
Everybody grab your mask. Everybody grab your mask. Come on! They're pushing the building down! Started pushing the wall.
Most significantly, the bug conversations recorded on the last day of the siege strongly suggest that some of the Davidians were spreading fuel throughout the compound, with the likely purpose of setting the fire that would ultimately consume the place and all but a few of those inside.
I think that there's ample evidence to establish that the Davidians set it up. A lot of what Koresh did was self-fulfilling prophecies. he'd read in the Bible this is what was supposed to happen, and I think he did things to bring about that eventuality. I mean, he's a paranoid schizophrenic, and then they attack his Mount Carmel, and then he responds like a nut, and they act surprised.
The FBI negotiators, meanwhile, still seemed unclear as to what had happened to the phone in the compound.
David, Stephen, you need to initiate contact with the negotiators over the phone. If that phone is no longer functional, if the line has been cut, please indicate so by putting some sort of a signal or flag out the front door.
Inside the compound, several Davidians wanted to send the suggested signal, but were concerned that it might be misinterpreted.
Well, someone put a white sheet out the window there. I don't know. What if they take it as surrender? We'll just hang it out the window.
We have observed the flag that you've placed outside the front door. You need to indicate to us whether or not the phone is working or whether or not you have thrown the phone out of the building. We have received reports that although we have not initiated fire towards you, there has been fire initiated towards the tanks. Therefore, we are not in a position to place our agents in jeopardy to deliver a phone to you at this time. This standoff, David, is over. You claim to be the leader, you claim to be the prophet, you claim to be the Messiah. The time is to lead your people out now.
David is no longer in control of the compound. The FBI is in control of that compound. He's no longer the Messiah.
It was noon. The assault on the compound had been underway for 6 hours. At 12:01, the last of the FBI's listening devices went dead. A few minutes later, fires began breaking out.
Bring your children and leave the building. The fire is plainly visible. We observed people lighting the fire. Leave the building.
This is Byron Sage. Don't lose control of this, David. Don't lose control of this. Bring those people out safely. Lead your people out, David. Be a Messiah, not a destroyer. It's 12:25. The compound looks to be totally engulfed in flame. At this point in time, it appears doubtful if there's many people left alive inside that compound.
At one point, Byron Sage left his loudspeaker to go outside, where someone snapped this picture of him with the burning compound in the background. Lawyer Joe Turner put the worst possible interpretation on the picture.
It was essentially a trophy photograph. In the middle of this fire, when these children are burning to death, the lead negotiator, who's supposed to try to protect all of us from this nightmare, is out there having this photograph taken while the house burns down. And that's shameful.
9 of Koresh's followers survived the fire. 75 did not.
David is found with a gunshot wound to the head that most people believe someone else inflicted, most likely Stephen Schneider, probably at David's request. Steve is found afterwards dead with a gunshot in the head, which is presumed to have been self-inflicted. Our best guess is that as the fire was coming in and people were dropping from smoke inhalation, that several of the people inside decided to end it all.
Was David Koresh a man unstoppable in his determination to commit suicide, or were the deaths the result of a major miscalculation on the part of the federal authorities? When we come back, we'll talk to the man who had to make many of the critical decisions at the time of the standoff, the FBI's Jeffrey Jamar.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by IBM.
The question of who started the fire at the Branch Davidian compound on April 19th of 1993 remains a favorite topic for conspiracy buffs, convinced that it was the government. 2 months ago on this program, we showed you some video that was taken by a fixed-wing government aircraft that flew over the site that day, equipped with an infrared video camera. Such cameras are particularly sensitive to heat. By day, they could, and on this occasion did, pinpoint the starting point of several fires inside the Branch Davidian compound. Joining me on Nightline that evening, Paul Gray, who was the chief arson investigator at Waco. A question that's bothered me all along, ever since I've seen your video shot from on high with the infrared, which is intended to be able to check out heat. Why'd you have a plane up there if you weren't expecting a fire?
I assumed, and I really don't know. You'd have to ask the Justice Department, ask the FBI, why did you have infrared? I assumed that it was to document locations of people that are actually exiting the building.
But by day, which is when these pictures were shot, people wouldn't have been visible on infrared inside the building and could have been clearly seen with the naked eye coming out. As we were last night, we are joined again by Jeffrey Jamar, who was the FBI on-scene commander at Waco and who last year retired from the FBI. That infrared camera aboard that fixed-wing aircraft, it bothered me then, it bothers me now. Why was it up there?
That aircraft and the other aircraft that was up was part of all our ability to observe. The live photographs were taken, still photographs were taken from that airplane. The infrared offers, the forward-looking infrared offers many different bits of information that beyond just heat. But it's also the crew and their powers of observation, and they're trained. That's what they do all the time is surveil from that aircraft, and they're up there to observe and run the film. You
understand what the thrust of the questioning is, and again, there were many more references than the ones that we've had an opportunity to play tonight or last night. All of them with reference to fire. Some of them casual references, some of them biblical references, but enough, and you have been asked this question many times over the past couple of years, and I'm sure have given it a great deal of thought yourself. Why were you not more prepared for the eventuality of a fire? You had an infrared camera up there, you didn't have fire engines on the ground.
If we'd have known there was going to be a fire at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we still would not have put firemen out in front of people who had automatic weapons, who had already killed 4 ATF agents and wounded 15 others. There are plenty of firemen in this country that are willing to sacrifice their lives to save people. There's no question about that. But I think it would be absolutely ridiculous to ask them to come in and be ready to fight a fire that's a possibility. You know, all the references to fire was constant. Had the Branch Davidians in Croatia decided to kill themselves by blowing the building up, or by coming out with and being exchanging fire and carrying a child with them, we would have been asked, did you anticipate that? We were afraid of all sorts of possibilities. We were concerned about them destroying themselves in many different ways. Fire was one of them. We were concerned about that place because it was a tinderbox. There's no question about that for the entire period of time.
You knew, based on that bug that we just heard, that tape, and I'm not quite sure at what hour that tape was first heard, where you could hear them spreading fuel. Were you aware at the time that that was going on?
We didn't hear that at the time. It took enhancements of the tapes to hear that, but that was right at 6 a.m. Our supposition is that they were preparing, and there are other comments on the tapes, that they were spraying the fuel and with presumption that we were coming in. They were going to wait for us to come into the compound and then start the fires. But another thing, I want to say this, I think when you characterized Mr. Turner's description of the photograph of Byron Sage a while ago, when you said he put it in the worst light, I think that's extremely unfair. I don't think anybody worked harder in the whole country to resolve this matter peaceably and save the people inside that compound. Nobody worked harder than Byron Sage did.
Let me just come back one more time to what I think you have told me, but I want you to spell it out for me one time. You have said, even if you had known that the fire was going to start at 12 noon, right, you wouldn't have called for the fire engine. So a decision had been made that if those folks set fire to the compound, you were going to let them burn.
No, what I said is that we would bring the fire trucks as soon as it was safe. I would not put firemen there at risk to be fired upon by people who have done that. Once Corus decided that that place was going to burn, and he was going to force those people to stay inside, many of whom I firmly believe wanted to get out, and he wouldn't let them out. Once he decided that, he wouldn't hesitate to shoot firemen to keep that place burning.
Then, because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding here, define for me at which point you thought it was safe.
Well, the hostage rescue team commander, I asked him, let me know when you feel it's safe for the firemen to come in. And he told me, and we let them in.
And that was based upon what facts on the ground?
Observation of gunfire.
So when you were sure that there was no gunfire and sure that there was no one capable of firing a gun, that was the time at which you deemed it safe?
Well, I think it was his judgment, and it was, of course, there were people who came out who were capable, who were armed, who were capable of firing. But he made the judgment that to get the firemen to come on in.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we will be back with more in just a moment. And we're joined once again by former FBI agent Jeffrey Jamar. Mr. Jamar, as you know, there are congressional hearings that are going to be held yet again. There have been previous hearings. What remains undone, unasked, unspoken, do you think?
Well, I think that most people who are familiar with the evidence are absolutely certain, and you made the statement that it was compelling evidence. I think it's absolutely overwhelming evidence that the Chorus ordered the people to start the fires, and he ordered the destruction of those poor people and the destruction of that compound. I think that'll come clear. The evidence was offered at the trial, and it was clear then. But a lot of people keep speculating on it, and there's no speculation about it. There's absolutely the evidence is absolutely convincing. But I think what will come out is this: that based on his actions on April 19th. That I firmly believe that this was Chorus's plan from the beginning, from the outset. I think he really believed that ATF was going to come right back at him. I think he started releasing children to hold them at bay till he could get reorganized. I think he was counting on, as part of his prophecy, that we would assault the compound. You know, you characterize our gassing of it as assault. You can argue semantics here, but we did not. It was a point not to enter the compound, because that's the part we did not want to step over that line to fulfill that part of his prophecy. And I think people are going to be persuaded that it was his plan from the beginning and his destruction of those people from the beginning. And I believe that a lot of them wanted to leave, but he just didn't permit it.
In the folklore that now is surrounding Waco and inevitably now Oklahoma City, those two events are linked together, not because there is any direct relationship between them, other than in the minds, perhaps, of some of those who are suspected of having blown up that building in Oklahoma City. And there is a sense that in many of these militant groups, there is a particular anger about what the government did in Waco. Now, I wonder if you would just speak to that general point.
It's just outrageous. It's that type of thinking that people need to examine. I think the one reason I agreed to be on your program is that I think it's important that people understand because we have not spoken about it, the FBI has not spoken about it for lots of different reasons, the main one being the pending prosecution at the beginning and pending civil actions now. But I'm hopeful that as time passes, that more and more information will get out and there will be a better understanding of it. Some people refuse to accept anything as being accurate because it doesn't fit their agenda. It doesn't fit what they want. And to rationalize something as outrageous as the bombing in Oklahoma City.
As you look back now on the original reason that caused the ATF agents to go to Waco in the first place, that is the possession of, it later turned out, they had more than 1 million rounds of ammunition and I don't know how many hundred different weapons there. If the same thing were to happen in another part of the United States tomorrow and someone called you up and said to you, Jeff, you've had a lot of experience with this, what do we do? What would you say?
Well, I think we said to ATF the same thing that the U.S. Attorney said to him, and we said to him at the Covenant Sword and Arm of the Lord compound in Arkansas in 1987, is to attempt to negotiate from the start without doing a dynamic entry. I don't want to speak for ATF. I don't know all the thinking that went into their decision making. I don't know everything that they knew at the time. But had they consulted us, we would have said The same thing we said to them in Arkansas in 1987. Let's figure out a way to deal with this without a direct confrontation.
And yet, after 51 days of negotiating, you ultimately came to the conclusion in Waco that the time for negotiation was over.
Well, I think not the time for negotiation was over. The negotiations were going nowhere. And I think the negotiations had not been true negotiations from any time. I think Corus had decided that from the beginning. I thought they did a wonderful job of communicating and keeping the situation from being more explosive. But it wasn't a matter of what's time to do this. Negotiations were going nowhere, and the situation was more and more dangerous as time passed.
Mr. Jamar, I thank you. It was good of you to come in, and I appreciate you talking to me.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. I'll be back in a moment. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
For Nightline transcripts, call 1-800-ALL-NEWS. For videocassette inquiries, call 1-800-913-3434. The price is $29.95, plus $4 for shipping and handling.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.